Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. So you may have heard of Occupy Wall Street activist Cecily McMillan. She was allegedly assaulted by a New York police officer on the 6-month anniversary of the Occupy movement 2 years ago. That night, police moved in to clear the park and make arrests, and during the chaos, McMillan's defense says that an officer grabbed her breast from behind, swung her around, and threw her to the ground. You can see here a picture of some of what her defense says were bruises from that night. Now her trial has come to a close, and Cecily was found guilty of assaulting an officer, which is a felony. She faces up to 7 years in prison. Now joining us to get into this case and discuss more is an attorney, Kevin Zeese. He's been following the case closely, and he's one of the original organizers of the national occupation of Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us, Kevin.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Kevin, just quickly, what was your reaction to the verdict?
Disappointment, severe disappointment, worried for Cecily, and not totally surprised because the judge in the case was very aggressive on the side of the prosecutor throughout the case, pre-trial and trial, and so it wasn't totally surprising that it turned out the way it did. But really disappointment, and also thinking about the context of our times, you know, with the police abuse all over the country. I saw the same day that I saw her conviction, I saw a tape of a Albuquerque City Council meeting where the citizens came in and took over the council meeting, so angry about police abuse. The same day also were articles about the Supreme Court refusing to hear the Hedges case against the NDAA, you know, which allows the military to hold people without charges. So it's a lot of these things coming together. It's a real attack on dissent, and but mostly I felt for Cecily.
So you mentioned that the judge really wasn't allowing the defense to show some really strong evidence that would have helped Cecily's case. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Well, the judge, Judge Zwiebel, and you know, I looked him up before I wrote about this case, and one of the first things you see when you look him up is he's a prosecutor in robes. So we know where his bias is. And you saw in some of the pretrial motions, one of the key issues was getting into the personnel file of the police officer involved, Grantley Bovell. And the judge refused to allow that. He only allowed a small portion that was before the jury, which was about his fixing tickets in the Bronx as part of the Bronx ticket fixing scandal, which that should have undermined his ethics right there, but I guess it wasn't enough for the jury. But there's more in his history of police abuse. In fact, that same night, there was a guy who had his head hit against the ground by Bovell, and he was in court, and he was ready to testify about that. The judge wouldn't let that in. But he wouldn't go into the personnel files and let this defense see any other kind of reprimands he's had, or any other kind of problems he's had. He's facing a number of at least 2 lawsuits for abusing citizens, and so none of that got in before the jury, so the jury didn't hear any of that. Then throughout the trial, whenever the government would make an objection, it was upheld. The judge agreed with the government whenever he said they objected to that, they objected to that question, that videotape, whatever, that line of questioning. But whenever the defense made an objection, it was almost always overruled. He always denied the defense. In fact, at one point, Marty Stoller, the defense lawyer, said, you know, what's going on here? You always believe what the prosecutor says, you never believe what I say. And so it was pretty evident. People in the courtroom were tweeting out about how the judge is just obviously against Cecily the whole way through. My hope was that the jury would see that. And sometimes you get a reverse reaction, and the jury says, oh boy, this judge is making it impossible. What's going on here? This is like a railroading. But that didn't work with this jury. That didn't come across with this jury. Instead, the jury allowed it to go the way it was. And so it was a very hard case for the defense to present their defense. There was no good videotape. That was one of the big problems. The only videotape that was had was after the breast grabbing, the alleged breast grabbing, which people saw pictures of her breast bruised with fingerprints on them, but they did have videotape of her hitting him.
Yeah, and that videotape, Kevin, because some people are going to see that and say, at the end of the day, she did hit an officer, she committed a crime, and you know, just because you
well, it's not a crime.
It's not a crime. Okay.
If you hit someone, you need to have criminal intent.
You need to have criminal intent.
You have to intend to commit a crime. What she looks like what she did from the evidence is that she reacted, and just someone grabbed her from behind. She didn't know who it was, and she reacted to push him off her. That's not criminal intent. And so it's not necessarily a crime if it really was just a reaction without her thinking about, I'm going to attack this officer. So that's the key issue. There was no real denial of her hitting the officer Bovell. The question was, did she do it intentionally with criminal intent, or was it just a kind of reaction?
Cecily's story sort of ties into a lot of, I think, Occupy protesters who came came forward saying that the way the police reacted to them was very aggressive. Can you speak to that a little bit? What were some of your experiences?
Well, especially in New York, that was true in the beginning. In fact, I would credit the police aggressiveness as helping Occupy to take off. I mean, there were two key incidents early in Occupy Wall Street in New York. One was in the first weekend. After they'd spent a week down, they had a weekend protest. They were marching Union Square. Police separated the crowd, arrested some people. There were some women behind some orange mesh, and a police officer with a white shirt, a white-collar cop, went over and pepper sprayed these women for no reason. It was, nonviolent protesters being abused by a police officer. They tried to deny it. They said the women would do something, but there were like 6 cameras from people's telephones that caught it all on camera. You could see they did nothing wrong. You could even see one of the blue-collar cops saying, "I can't believe you just pepper sprayed her." The media coverage of that really sided with the women who were pepper sprayed and against the cop, who's now faced all sorts of discipline issues because of that. And that really helped to spark the movement. The second thing that sparked the movement was when the police kind of directed the protesters into the roadway of the Brooklyn Bridge rather than the sideways. And 700 people were arrested that day, kettled on the bridge. Once they got on the bridge, the police closed them off, and
yeah, I remember that
arrested
day.
Hundreds of people. So, and you saw these similar kind of incidents in other cities. Some cities have a long reputation of police abuse. Oakland, for example, has a terrible reputation of a police force that's out of control. They've been under federal court orders, and they've been monitored by federal judges. And during Occupy, they were very aggressive. And there have been lots and lots of settlements, both in New York and Oakland, on behalf of occupiers who were abused. Other police, I think the D.C. police use a different strategy. They've been sued multiple times in the late 1900s and the early part of this century, and they've had some pretty big judgments against them. They've been more cautious, and I think they've learned that a soft pillow approach is better. Unless the protesters give the police a justification that the public will agree with, they take a soft pillow approach and allow the protesters to do what we want to do, and that makes it actually harder for us to grow. We get less media attention, people get less sympathy for us, they're less aware of us. The only times, really the times when the police got aggressive in D.C. was when the public started to turn against Occupy, and if occupiers went a little bit over the line. Nothing ever really seriously violent or anything happened in the Occupy in Washington, D.C. But enough of a justification of the police could then go ahead and be a little more aggressive, and then you saw that. But pretty much the police didn't take that approach in D.C.
Okay, let's go back to Cecily's case. What can we expect next for her?
Well, she's in jail right now. After she was found guilty, the judge did what we call stepped her back into prison. She's at Rikers Island, and the sentencing on the 19th. Pre-trial, the judge said to Cecily that if she didn't take the plea bargain, she'd get a longer sentence after a trial. Now, a longer sentence, we don't know what that's going to mean. It could be up to 7 years. The plea bargain that was offered was she had to plead to a felony. She didn't want to plead to a felony because she didn't think she did anything, but she would get probation. So longer than probation, okay, we'll see what that could be. Time served. It could be a year. It could be much longer, and we don't know what's going to happen. Now, Judge Zwabella is pretty much a prosecutor's judge. We know what the prosecutor is going to ask for either. Whether or not the prosecutor requests a long sentence or recognizes that she's already had 2 years of stress from this and going through a very difficult trial and now spending multiple weeks in prison. Maybe that's enough to satisfy the prosecutor. We'll see. This case shouldn't have been prosecuted. I think the district attorney, Cy Vance, made a gigantic error in prosecuting this case. They got a conviction. They only got a conviction because they had a judge who was very much on the side of the prosecutor and really maneuvered the jury in that direction. That's a real sad reality. And unfortunately, it's all too common in U.S. justice, because you look at who becomes judges, it's often prosecutors, often corporate lawyers. It's very rarely a defense lawyer or a civil rights lawyer or a consumer lawyer. It's usually a prosecutor or a corporate lawyer becomes a judge.
All right, we're going to certainly keep track of this case, and we'll love to have you back on to give us an update. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio.
Happy to do it. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.